The mind-muscle connection can be described as the feeling of muscle contraction while lifting. This is often used as an indicator that you are providing a good training stimulus for a specific muscle. So, is the mind-muscle connection really a good indicator of an effective training stimulus? And in practical terms, should we focus on trying to improve the mind-muscle connection while lifting? While the mind-muscle connection is an internal sensation, we can use intentional effort to maximize this feeling. This is what is known as attentional focus while lifting. Essentially, there are two ways we can think about lifting a weight. We can use an internal focus or an external focus. An internal attentional focus is when we focus on contracting the muscle we are trying to train. So we are focusing on things such as squeezing the muscle at the top of the lift and controlling the load on the way down to keep all the stress on the muscle. And as you can imagine, this attentional focus would usually result in a superior mind-muscle connection. On the other hand, an external attentional focus doesn't require any focus on which muscles are involved in the movement. An external focus simply requires trainees to focus on moving the load from point A to point B. This attentional focus strategy would usually result in a less pronounced mind-muscle connection compared with an internal focus. So what we want to know is, does an internal attentional focus, in other words, focusing more on the mind-muscle connection, actually result in superior muscle growth, compared with just trying to move the load from one point to another? This is a debatable topic because we don't have much evidence on this question. As far as I am aware, we only have one study which directly assessed hypertrophy outcomes with these two different attentional focus strategies. This study compared quad and bicep growth from leg extension and barbell curl training. One group trained with an internal focus, where they were instructed to squeeze the muscle, while the other group trained with an external focus, where they were instructed to just get the weight up. It was found that there were slightly conflicting results. The biceps saw superior hypertrophy with the internal focus, while the two quad muscles saw similar muscle growth in both conditions. While we have mixed results from this study, I would speculate that this may be a result of differences in lifting technique. The barbell curl is much more susceptible to technique deviation, while the leg extension is almost impossible to change technique because it has a fixed movement pattern. Therefore, an internal attentional focus may have been superior for biceps growth because it probably resulted in stricter, full range of motion technique, maximizing tension on the biceps. While the attentional focus probably didn't matter all that much for the leg extensions because technique can't change very much either way. So the stimulus on the quads would probably have been basically the same since both groups trained all the way to failure. And this concept is applicable to other exercises too. When we are performing free weight exercises, we may provide a better stimulus by focusing on the mind-muscle connection, as it can have a positive influence on technique. On the other hand, machine-based exercises may not really benefit from either attentional focus strategy since technique cannot really change. Another influence that our attentional focus can have is on lifting performance. Generally, we find that lifters are able to lift more weight or perform more reps when using an external attentional focus. In other words, not focusing on the mind-muscle connection. For example, this study explored the effects of attentional focus on squat and deadlift performance. Trainees performed a set of squats and deadlifts for as many reps as possible with 80% 1RM using either an internal or external focus. And as we can see in the orange bars, lifting with an external focus allowed lifters to perform around 1 to 2 more reps for both exercises. This doesn't necessarily indicate that focusing on the mind-muscle connection will provide a worse hypertrophic stimulus. In fact, the internal focus actually resulted in greater quads and hamstrings muscle activation compared with an external focus. However, this study does suggest that an internal focus may compromise lifting performance to some extent. There are two possible reasons I can think of which may be responsible for this decrease in lifting performance. This is probably mostly due to something we mentioned earlier, which is lifting technique. As we discussed, trainees will usually lift with a stricter, more controlled technique when implementing an internal attentional focus. And as a result, trainees probably won't be able to lift quite as much load, or may not be able to perform as many reps in a set because of this. whereas lifting with an external focus will likely allow superior lifting performance at the expense of strict technique. And another speculation I have is that this compromise in lifting performance could possibly be a result of changes in proximity to failure. While we don't have evidence on this, I notice personally that if I focus too much on the mind-muscle connection while lifting, I can often stop a set slightly further from failure than I otherwise would have. This may be a result of putting too much thought into trying to feel the muscle, causing me to put less attention into actually training hard. I think you can certainly do both, but this is just a reminder to make sure you are still taking each set close to failure when focusing on the mind-muscle connection. So overall, an internal attentional focus will probably result in slightly inferior lifting performance compared with an external focus. Exactly why this is the case is not entirely clear, but it could potentially be due to stricter technique or possibly a further proximity from failure. Training with strict technique is not an issue for hypertrophy training, but we do need to make sure we are still taking each set close to failure. It should also be noted that if you were focused more on strength gains rather than muscle growth, then you may want to adopt an external focus for your primary strength lifts, as this will probably have a positive effect on performance. It is also worth mentioning that the mind-muscle connection is likely to be more or less pronounced when training with different exercises. More specifically, there is likely to be differences in this sensation when training with compound versus isolation lifts. In general, trainees usually report feeling a greater connection with isolation lifts targeting one specific muscle group. And usually we feel less of a connection with compound lifts training multiple muscles and joints, even if we are intentionally trying to adopt an internal attentional focus. This may be because with compound lifts, there are more stimuli being presented at once. We have more total muscle tissue actively contracting, and we have a larger involvement of other systems, such as the cardiorespiratory system. As a result, we may not feel or take as much notice of the mind-muscle connection. On the other hand, isolation lifts involve fewer stimuli since there is less active muscle contraction and lower cardiorespiratory demands. As a result, we may take more notice of the mind-muscle connection sensation in the specific muscle we are training. This doesn't necessarily mean that isolation lifts will always provide a superior hypertrophy stimulus, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't implement an internal attentional focus for compound lifts either. It is just important to note that the mind-muscle connection is a sensation, which may be more or less prevalent during different movements. In fact, it may even be beneficial to adopt an internal focus during compound lifts too. There is some evidence that if we focus on a specific muscle during a compound lift, we may actually preferentially train that muscle. For example, this study explored the effects of bench press training with different attentional focus strategies. Trainees performed a set of bench press to failure with 85% 1RM using an internal and external focus. For the external conditions, trainees were instructed to focus on driving the weight towards an external object in one condition and towards the ceiling in another condition. For the internal condition, trainees were instructed to focus specifically on lifting with their chest. It was found that despite the internal focus resulting in slightly less reps performed, pec activity was slightly greater throughout the set. Although this isn't a direct measure of hypertrophy, it provides some evidence that adopting an internal focus during compound lifts could potentially bias certain muscles. We can't conclusively say that this will result in greater long-term muscle growth of these specific muscles, but I think it is worth focusing on targeting a specific muscle group of the compound lift that you want to bias. So if the mind-muscle connection is just a sensation, how is it relevant for hypertrophy training? Some may argue that it has no meaning, but I would say that it can be used as a general indicator of effective training. I think that feeling a strong mind-muscle connection is somewhat of a good sign that you are effectively training that particular muscle well. However, we should also understand that this should be used as an indicator in conjunction with the other important training principles too. This means it is still important to train close to failure with good technique and sufficient volume. We can't only rely on the mind-muscle connection. So what does all of this mean regarding what we practically do in the gym? Well, I think that there are two practical takeaways that can help us make our training sessions more effective. First is that it may be useful to adopt an internal attentional focus when the goal is to maximize muscle growth. This means focusing on contracting a specific muscle rather than focusing on moving the load from one point to another. This might indirectly improve the hypertrophic stimulus by promoting strict and effective lifting technique, which we know is likely to have a positive effect on muscle growth. And the second practical takeaway is that we can use the mind-muscle connection to guide training decisions. While we have general training guidelines that are generally applicable to most people, there is always individual variation between people. The mind-muscle connection gives us instantaneous feedback about the training stimulus. We can then make informed decisions based on this internal feedback. More specifically, we can adjust training variables such as the load and rep ranges used, make slight adjustments to technique, and select the most effective exercises using this sensory information. However, like we discussed throughout this video, it is still important to make sure that this is used in conjunction with other variables. We still want to make sure that we are training close to failure with good technique and sufficient volume. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.